over the past couple years, we've heard a lot of hype about biofuels and how it's possible that biofuels will, start taking us away from oil and could possibly supplant or replace gasoline within the confines of American transportation culture, what have you. But I think when one looks a little further at the ramifications of the utilization of land and food crops for massive amounts of plants for fuel purposes, I think we find that the reasoning for utilizing those resources in such a manner is, foolhardy at best and very specious at worst. For instance, I want to start out, with a little quote from Jean Ziegler. He's the UN special rapporteur. I mean, that's a tough one for me. On food, he called the use of arable land for biofuels a crime against humanity, and he called for a 5-year moratorium on biofuel production. In order to kind of do a little more research to see exactly whether this was going to be a legitimate way to get fuel or not, and how far its effects on the population of the so-called third world would go. I do want to clarify, though, at the moment that there is a movement. I think here I know there's a solid one here in the States and especially here in the Atlanta region. I know there's one in the UK as well. There's probably various movements across the world that utilize waste cooking oil and they reprocess it and make biofuel for those purposes, and that's good because it's obviously not going to be utilized for anything else, and every little bit can count, but it's not a viable way to take care of the oil and gasoline needs that we currently have. What we're going to have to do, and I think this is the overall point here, is we're going to have to cut consumption. That's really the only solution as far as the oil crisis. And I think that what we have when we constantly try and put biofuels forth as this solution, we're looking for that magic bullet, the silver bullet that kills the monstrous werewolf. And the monstrous werewolf is, people are going to have to, engage in public transit, public transportation here in the States. That perhaps people starving to death in the so-called third world and the massive effects of deforestation for biofuel crops, causes things that people aren't willing to give up. People in the in these regions, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, etc. And we'll get into that in a little more detail in a minute. They don't see the need to give up their lives, their livelihoods, their resources, so that we can sit in traffic jams all across the nation in all of our large cities. Another thing, before we get into more about that, another thing is that perhaps it's not even viable in and of itself, even before we get into the effects on humanity. For instance, ethanol apparently has only 2/3 the energy content of gasoline, and biodiesel gets you about 90%, which means that if you're mixing diesel and biodiesel or ethanol and regular gasoline, the greater the mix is in favor of the biofuel or ethanol, the less gas mileage you will wind up getting because the energy content is a little less. And ethanol also could possibly be costly because it can't be transported by the most low-cost pipelines that we have now, because it has a propensity for absorbing water and other impurities inside the pipeline that are apparently necessary for transporting the other oil and other fuels that go through those pipelines. There's been a few studies done, actually, a couple of primary ones, I think in 2005. One was done by Cornell University, where they just pretty much dismissed the idea altogether. You should look into that. The University of Minnesota did another one where they said that biofuels could be useful, but there had to be a lot more work done as far as the efficacy of of utilizing arable land for that could be used for food, for fuel purposes, and utilizing existing food stores and existing food for fuel purposes. They also mentioned that the USA used 14% of the corn harvest in 2005 to make about 4 billion gallons of ethanol, which is only about 1.7% of the current gas usage. And Also, they noted it takes about 1,700 gallons of water to make 1 gallon of ethanol, apparently, which obviously would cause other problems if you started making ethanol in mass, because then that could lead to, in addition to the food crisis that exists, a possible water shortage as well. Another thing we have to get into is deforestation. The ostensible reason for going to biofuel is CO2 emissions, right? CO2 emissions from the various producers. I can't even think of them off the top of my head. I mean, there's so many of them. It's so massive. They're so ubiquitous that sometimes you can't even pick it out. It's like not being able to see the forest for the trees, But the ostensible reason is to get rid of the CO2 in the atmosphere. But the deforestation that is apparently being planned in Indonesia, Malaysia, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, where they call biodiesel the diesel of deforestation, etc., is going to cause more CO2 emissions than it alleviates, because as you cut down trees, well, they absorb it. They absorb carbon dioxide and make oxygen, which, apparently I've heard nasty rumors that everyone needs to survive. And I personally can confirm those nasty rumors. So deforestation, leads to more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, less oxygen, which, not so good for the kids. Also, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization estimates 25 to 30% of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere now is because of deforestation. It's only, and also you have to understand that it's going to destroy about, perhaps by 2022, 98% of the Indonesian rainforest. And that's bad for other reasons, because of endangered species, losing their habitats, indigenous persons who depend on the rainforest for their livelihoods and for their ways of life that have continued for centuries or what have you. And also, of course, you have to keep in mind that rainforests, again, produce tremendous amounts of oxygen. The World Wildlife Fund says 80% of Brazil's greenhouse gas emissions stem from deforestation. And that's important because Brazil is put forth as like the model for dependence upon biofuels, because they went to that program in the 70s during the gas inflation and the OPEC crisis, etc. And they use about, I want to say, about 50 or 60% of their sugarcane to make about 40 to 50% of their fuel needs, which, again, ostensibly to cut down on that carbon dioxide, but as you deforest, it just creates more. And this is, like I said, this continues to go on. Oil palm plantation development accounts for about 87% of deforestation in Malaysia. Like I said, the orangutan could possibly go extinct in the wild if continued plans for massive clearing continue in Indonesia. Forest fires are often set by people in order to force people who live in the rainforest off the land so that it can be cleared, turned into plantations for the excuse me. For the biofuels. The people who used to live there are going to have, two choices. They can go be urban slum dwellers. They can work on this plantation. Obviously, a choice between a rock and a hard place. Another thing you have to discuss when it comes to biofuels is the fact that it has, tremendous impact upon food prices. The IMF actually said that food prices rose about 10% in 2007, and although the IMF, if the IMF, is going that far to say, hey, food prices are going up big time, they're probably right, because they tend to like it when prices go up. We'll get more into the effects of biofuels on the price of food in part 2.